Good evening.
We're going to start with Kayla Barnes leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance. She's a fifth grade student at James Hurst Elementary School. She's 10 years old and the daughter of a former legislative assistant, DeAndre Barnes. Kayla.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Before we get started, I want to recognize the elected officials in the audience, not in order of protocol, but in order that they showed up. Angela Allen, Portsmouth School Board. Paige Cherry, Portsmouth Treasurer. Michael Moore, Portsmouth Sheriff. Cynthia Morrison, Clerk of Court. And we also have Scott Miller, President of Virginia Wesleyan University. Well, thank you very much for coming. The topic of the, Aaron, representing Mark Warner's office. Give Aaron a round of I think people are aware that very recently we passed a bill affecting taxes, and what we're going to do today is have a discussion about how the tax cut bill and a little bit on the recent budget bill, how that affects everyday people in the 3rd Congressional District. Before we get started, before we start talking about the tax cut, thank you. Is this better?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I was at an event a couple of years ago where I spoke, and then Owen Pickett, former congressman from the 2nd District, spoke, and then the Secretary of Transportation, I believe, came up to speak, and somebody said, "Can you use the other mic because that mic wasn't working?" They didn't say anything about it mic not working when I was speaking, Owen was speaking, but he wanted to hear what he had to say. So I appreciate your comment. A little background on the federal budget as to where we are and how we got here. Since 1967, you can see in this chart, green being how much the revenues are, and the red, how much we're spending. And this is before the tax cut, so this line, the revenue, is actually going to be worse. You can see that generally we were spending about 20% of the gross domestic product and bringing in about 17% of the gross domestic product. And in 1996, after we passed the 92-93 budget, we significantly reduced spending and increased revenue, and actually had a surplus. We had more revenue than we were spending. And in fact, if that had kept going, we would have paid off the entire debt held by the public by 2008. Put all the money back in the trust funds that we had borrowed by 2013. But right at the peak, about 2001, we passed tax cuts that weren't paid for, less revenue, and ended up spending more spending. The 2008, that's when everything kind of fell apart. We actually had to increase spending to deal with the recession, and we had less revenue. But when things came back together, the spending continued to go up. Revenue, because of the tax cuts, did not keep up with it, and we had a significant growing deficit. This is another way to show it. 1992-93, we passed this is the fiscal cliff deal. This is the annual federal deficit. We show the deficit getting less and less and less. In about 96, it went into a surplus and then collapsed, started to recover, but then totally collapsed. And this budget situation is a bipartisan situation because right here we passed the so-called cliff deal. We extended all the tax cuts that got us in the ditch. And so if we had done nothing, we'd almost balance the budget. Just do nothing. As I like to say, don't just do something, stand there. But instead we passed the cliff deal, extending the tax cuts, and we're back way in the ditch. And like I said, this is before the tax cut, so this line is probably going to be worse than in the future because of the tax cut bill. And so with that background, we passed a tax cut bill. Some key points: the tax cuts for individuals and families, temporary, permanent for corporations. Over 10 years, 83% of the benefits go to the top 1%. CBO estimates that these tax cuts will cost $1.5 trillion over 10 years. And Speaker Ryan and the Tax Foundation estimate the creation, when they say it's going to grow the economy, about 300 and some thousand jobs. That's about over $4 million per job. Not a very good amount of growth. In fact, if you look at the estimates that they're going to have for the transportation bill, the infrastructure bill that's coming up, you'll see tens of millions of jobs for the same $1.5 trillion. We should have done, if growth is your goal, you ought to be doing tens of millions, not a couple of 100,000. Some of the key changes. This is now, these charts will be on my website tomorrow, so you don't have to take notes. We have 7 tax rates that where the tax rate goes down. Most of the benefit for the top 1% come from the fact that the upper income the marginal rate, 39.6, is reduced to 37. So the top income people, those making several $100,000 a year, will be paying about more than 2% less taxes, and that's why a lot of the benefit goes to them. The standard deduction that everybody gets goes from $6,300 for single, and $12,000 for married, to $12,000 for single, $24,000 for married. That is a huge benefit. But as you'll see in the next page, you lose some personal exemptions. So depending on the size of your family, this may be a good thing or maybe a net bad thing. State and local taxes are deductible. Now state and local taxes only up to $10,000 will be deductible. The mortgage interest deduction, you can deduct the interest on your mortgage up to properties up to mortgage value of $1 million today. They reduced that to up to $750,000. But the big deal is that home equity loan interest, that's when you take out a second mortgage, that interest will not be deductible anymore. And that's going to come as a surprise to a lot of people because they didn't know that was in there. The individual mandate in Obamacare, under the Affordable Care Act today, if you don't have health coverage, you have to pay a tax penalty. That penalty was eliminated. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. There are a couple of technical changes that one is, this is actually a good one, medical expense deduction. If you have medical expenses over 10% of your income, you can deduct your medical expenses. Next year will be 7.5%, so if you have over 7.5% of your income, you can deduct your medical expenses. But that's only for a year. it comes back the next year. There are other little technical changes like elimination for job-related moves, steps, lobby expenses, brokerage, tax preparation, and miscellaneous write-offs, and unreimbursed expenses. If you use your car for your employer and don't get reimbursed, today you can deduct those expenses. Next year you will not. There are a couple of other little technical changes. One is the $4,000 deduction for educational expenses will no longer be there. And alimony changes. Today, whoever's paying alimony, if you were divorced by the end of last year, whoever's paying the alimony can deduct that from their taxes. The person receiving the alimony pays tax on that money. That's changing so that the payer of the alimony cannot deduct the income, and so the payer of the income will pay the taxes on that income. Now that, for the couple, will generally mean a tax increase because the person paying the alimony is generally in a higher bracket than the person receiving the alimony. So in the old days, the person receiving the alimony will pay tax at a lower rate than the person paying it, but that's changing under this tax law. So that's a slight increase for those in that situation. If you were divorced before in the last year, then you continue to play by the old rules. Standard deduction, this shows for 2017. That's when you pay taxes in April. You get a $4,000 and $50 personal exemption for everybody in the family. Standard deduction, married 12, single 6, goes to 24 and 12. Now, if you don't have any children, you're probably a lot better off with the increased standard deduction, so you'll be better off if you have a large family and lose a $4,000 deduction for everybody in the family, you're probably going to be a lot worse off. Next year, this is the distribution of who's getting the tax cut, 20-some% for the top 1%, the next 4%, 24%, down to the poorest 20%, get 1% of the benefits. That's next year. But by 2025, 2026, 2027, in the 10-year period, a lot of those tax cuts for individuals dissolve and are repealed. And so in 2027, the richest 1% will still have about a $7,000 tax break. The next 4% will get about a $1,000 tax break. The next 20-40% will about break even. But the middle 20%, second, and the poorest 20% will actually, 53% of Americans at the end of this period will actually be paying higher taxes than they were under present law. The bill's impact on health care, I said that the repealing the individual mandate. Now, the reason the mandate is in there isn't because anybody likes the mandate. It's because if you're going to cover people with pre-existing conditions, you have to have everybody buying insurance. You cannot let people wait until they get sick before they buy insurance, because people will wait until they get sick before they buy insurance. Everybody with insurance would tend to be sicker, and so the average cost goes up. And as it goes up, fewer people want to buy the insurance, and there is a name for that process. It's called the death spiral. New York State was in the death spiral when the Affordable Care Act passed. They required insurance companies to issue insurance at a standard rate, but did not require people to buy insurance. And when the costs were going up through the roof, and when the Affordable Care Act came in, the new price for insurance was less than half of the individual rate when the Affordable Care Act passed. Washington State tried to do guaranteed issue without the mandate. And in 4 years, it got so bad that nobody could buy individual insurance. They had to change the law to make sure people could buy insurance. So that's why we have the mandate. And so by removing the mandate, you first of all jeopardize insurance companies from wanting to sell insurance because they don't know who they're going to be selling insurance to. They know what the average cost is, but if people don't have to buy insurance until they get sick, they may be only insuring not everybody, but just the sick people. And so they don't know how to price it. So a lot of companies will just drop out. But CBO said that because people no longer have the mandate, they may not buy insurance. They estimate that 13 million fewer people will have insurance because of that provision, and because the people not buying insurance will tend to be the healthy people who don't think they need insurance. Everybody with insurance costs will go up about 10%. And so as more healthy people drop out, the remaining people will be sicker, and that number, the 10%, might well go even higher. The 13 million people without insurance, the way they calculated this was interesting because they found that a lot of people are on Medicaid today throughout the country because they went to sign up for the Affordable Care Act and found out, well, they were eligible for Medicaid. If you don't have to sign up for the Affordable Care Act, you won't know that you were eligible for Medicaid, and they estimate that about 4 or 5 million people will not have insurance because they didn't know they were eligible for Medicaid. The employers, fewer employers will provide insurance, and when you get to the total, you get to 13 million people. Now, the loss of the, as I said, the loss of the mandate will prompt insurers to simply exit the marketplace. And this change has a potential to harm people who need the coverage because those with pre-existing conditions, if they stop offering the insurance, people obviously won't be able to get it. Next question, if you got a $1.5 trillion tax cut, who's going to pay for it? Well, there were no pay-fors in the legislation, but one day, people are going to have to pay for it. First of all, when they say it's going to pay for itself, this is when we passed the Bush tax cuts. This is total revenue for the federal government. When we passed the tax cuts, revenues went down. Passed another tax cut, revenues went down. Revenues started recovering. Great Recession, revenues went down. If you did this chart back 70 years, you will see that virtually every year we set a new record in revenues. Tax cut, no tax cut, tax increase, tax cut, every year. And so the effect of the tax cut on revenues is nominal, but if you have a huge tax cut, you can expect lower revenues, and that's what's anticipated going forward. Where can you find $1.5 trillion? Well, that's going to be tough. One, you could repeal the corporate tax rate, put it back to 35% rather than 21% in the bill. That'll get you most of it back. You only get about $388 billion if you go to return to the 2000 exemption rate. That is, you start paying the state tax at $1 million. If you go back to that, you get 388, about 135. If you go back to the 2009 rate, which is 3.5 million, after 3.5 million, 7 million a couple, then you start paying the estate tax. To see what you'd have to do with Medicare, if you raise the Medicare age to 67, raise it 2 years, you only get $125 billion. If you change CPI, that's reduce the cost of living increase for Social Security, you get about $112 billion. So you would have to do a whole lot of damage to Social Security and Medicare if you're not going into the estate tax or the corporate tax rate or the upper income tax rates. If you're not going there, it's going to be hard to find $1.5 trillion. Now, Speaker Ryan has indicated that the plan is to pass the tax cuts and then focus on spending cuts. And like I said in the previous chart, there's not a lot of opportunity there. But they didn't want to talk about how you're going to pay for it, because obviously if people knew you were going to cut Social Security in order to pass the tax cuts, I think most people would say, well, let's just not do the tax cuts. If you do the tax cuts first and then say, oh my goodness, we're broke, we got to cut something, in Social Security and Medicare or on the chopping block, they think they can get away with that and people not notice why you're having to cut Social Security and Medicare. As an example of how out of touch people are, the Speaker of the House wrote a tweet. A Secretary of Public High School said she was pleasantly surprised to find out that her income had gone up $1.50 a week. It could pay her Costco membership. Shortly after that tweet was posted, it was deleted. If you find that tweet and then go through the thread or whatever they call the comment section, you'll know why he deleted that tweet. But if you look at the Republican budgets, Medicare, Medicaid, food assistance, investments in job training and education, that's where the money is going to come from. And I think if people had been advised of that up front, you'd have had more opposition to the tax cuts. Now we passed, following the tax cuts, we passed the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. It had about a little over $300 billion in additional spending. It took care of the sequester, which meant if we didn't meet our budget targets, there would be automatic, across the board cuts in everything, military and everything else. And nobody wanted that to happen. So we finally passed the budget. Some of the highlights, it takes care of, fully undoes sequestration for the next 2 years, protecting our military and other important programs from those harmful automatic cuts. Provides additional funding for military and domestic. Military, significant increase, and a lot of that is in shipbuilding, which will do a lot of good for this area. And domestic funds education, healthcare, non-defense, national security. The domestic budget, non-defense budget also includes veterans benefits, FBI, domestic terrorism, and things like that. Domestic has significant national security initiatives. Covers the Children's Health Insurance Program, the CHIP program, for an additional 4 years, for a total, we did 6 years a few weeks ago, additional 4 years. I can tell you that was actually easy to do, because when we eliminated the mandate and the cost went up in the marketplace, most people don't pay the increase, because if you're in the marketplace, you're paying a percentage of your income. And so it just became more expensive for the federal government to cover people with the tax credits because the cost had gone up. We figured out that it would be cheaper if they just stayed on CHIP, because CHIP has a state component to it. State helps pay for CHIP. And so if we can keep them on CHIP, the federal government would actually save money. And so the cost of extending CHIP actually turned out to be a profit, because if people left CHIP and came into the marketplace, the tax credits would be more than we were paying for their child health insurance plan. And so we took advantage of that and extended CHIP 10 years. Community health centers we extended for 2 years. There's several community health centers in Hampton Roads, Norfolk, Portsmouth, Peninsula, all over Hampton Roads have community health centers that are there. Is that Barbara? Barbara Willis runs one of the community health centers, so we got you for 2 years. All right. Now funding, this is showing what happens with non-defense discretionary spending. It's $131 billion over the cap, what we should have been able to spend if we had abided by the caps, significantly more than the previous couple of years. But you'll notice, even with that additional spending, we're still under what we had spent non-defense discretionary spending in 2010. And that the money goes to education, infrastructure, scientific research, but like I said, it's still lower than we spent. So although it's a great relief, it's not nearly where we should be. In fact, this is where we were headed. This is non-defense spending as a percentage of GDP, and you'd see in the 1970s we'd gotten up to about 5%. By 2002, we were down to about 3%. We got up, and we were headed below the 3% line, and this is where we would be under the budget control caps and sequestration. So we're actually going to be spending in 2013, we're probably a little closer to the 3% line. Debt and deficits. We can't show you a debt and deficit chart because the CBO hasn't redone the baseline based on the tax cut bill. But you know, if you add 1.5 trillion to the fiscal irresponsibility that we're already on, you know it's not going to be a pretty sight. And there's no more. There is a more balanced way to both reduce the debt and raise revenue and continue funding our non-defense services and defense services if we figure out what we need to spend and then raise taxes to do it. And if you're not going to raise the taxes to do it, then you ought not spend it. The problem we had in doing a budget is that the budget numbers had gotten so low, so many things had to be cut that people just didn't want to be associated with the budget, and we couldn't pass one because nobody wanted to vote for it. The 1.5 trillion more in tax cuts doesn't help. This is a chart showing debt held by the public debt. Back to the 1960s, 45, 30% of GDP. When we passed the Clinton budget in '93, we started paying off, and we started reducing the national debt to the point where I said if we had kept going the way we were going, we'd have paid it off by 2008. Unfortunately, we are headed towards increasing debt. This is where we are now, about 75% of GDP, gradually going up close to 90% of GDP, and this is before the tax bill gets added on. Most people think that you're going to break 100 by 2027 if we don't make some significant changes. Most economists think 100% of GDP is really a tipping point, because if you've got more debt than the entire economy, that's going to be hard to sustain. And so that's where we are with our budget, where we are with the budget bill, and be pleased to take questions right after I introduce Constella Williams, who is the Vice Chair of the Portsmouth School Board. If people have questions, if you just come forward, Ben has the mic, and line up, and we'll take as many questions as we can. Yes, sir.
Good evening, and thanks for the face-to-face. It's very important. I'm a senior, 65 and above. Now, where does this tax help me? Because we used to get a little deduction there because you're 65 on a certain date. And also, in 2018 and 2020, if Congress and the current president is just one term, is there a plan to roll back this tax, reform a little bit, to make it more user-friendly?
Well, the tax rates are subject to change by law. I mean, the tax bill changed the tax rates. They can be passed the House, passed the Senate, be signed by the President, and be changed again. And so I think in the next 3 years, the likelihood of major changes to increase revenues would be unlikely because at least you'd have to pass the House and the Senate and overcome a presidential veto. In terms of what happens to your personal income, it depends on your income. If you're a multimillionaire, you're doing well. If you're down on the bottom half, 53% of the people towards the end will be paying more taxes than they are under present law.
How you doing? The question I have is the slide that you showed, the standard deduction where it changed, then up under it had state and local taxes and then mortgage interest. Usually you can only itemize or take the standard deduction. So if that's still the same, if you're married with $24,000 deduction, really, you know, if you have like $11,000 worth of interest, $5,000 in personal property and state taxes, it really kind of defeats the purpose, or is it something that we're missing?
No, you got it. About 95% of the people will be taking, they estimate, the standard deduction because their itemized deductions won't exceed $24,000. And frankly, unless it exceeds $24,000 by a meaningful number, you probably don't want to attract an audit. You just take the standard deduction, be finished with it. If you do all this itemizing, those are the ones that the IRS audits. And insofar as very few people will be itemizing, they'll have fewer targets. So you don't want to be one. Standard deduction, the personal exemptions are eliminated. And so if you have several children, you're probably worse off. If you've got no children, you're probably better off. But with 95%, I tell you, one effect of this is that most people, at least many people, will essentially lose their home interest deduction because as you add it up, it doesn't get you to $24,000. And so you'll just take the standard deduction and get no tax benefit for owning a home. That is why the realtors oppose the bill, because they like to, and when they're selling houses, they say, well, you can deduct the interest. That's a nice tax benefit for owning a home. For about over 90% of the people, they won't be able to say that anymore.
Follow-up question. And you're absolutely right, because in my situation, I itemize and I come out between $19,000 and $20,000 a year. I have 2 kids in college that I claim, so I'm losing around $16,000 and some change in personal deductions. And so I'm going from $36,000 subtracting from my taxable income to $24,000. So I guess my question is it any benefit on claiming your children now? For college children,
Well, there's also the child tax credit. There's a child tax credit that goes in, so you have to add that with the personal exemption and the standard deduction. But the $4,000 deduction for educational expenses evaporated. That was a temporary tax benefit that was not extended in this bill.
So make it clear, so for college-age kids that don't get that child tax credit, it's no benefit to claim your college kids anymore.
That's probably right, because you don't get a personal exemption.
So there's no personal exemption, so they might as well claim themselves now, and take the, okay, all right, thank you.
Now, wait a minute, I'm not giving legal advice here. You've got to talk to your accountant to go through all your personal situation.
Mr. Scott, thank you. My question is related to jobs. As you had in your slide, they say so many jobs are coming. Most of those jobs are going to be either technological or contract jobs based on how business is done today. Some time ago, President Trump changed the rules in which corporations have to report employment because he felt it was too cumbersome for them to do. So related to 2013-2014 timeframe, President Obama had legislation requiring government contractors who made over $10,000 a year off the government to actually put metrics together on hiring veterans so that actual metrics could be seen as to how many veterans were being hired through all these jobs that were being created? What is being done to ensure that hasn't gone away and to possibly ensure that it's continuing to be done, because it doesn't seem in some areas that it has any traction?
I'm not sure about veterans, but there was an EEOC form that is supposed to be, that you have to file indicating who you have hired. One of the additions to that form was that you'd have to indicate not only your employees disaggregated by race and gender, but also indicate the salary. That would be able to look at the chart and see that all the men are making high salaries, all the women are making low salaries, so EEOC would have something to look at. Also, Office of Contract Compliance, Office of Federal Contract Compliance could look at it to see if you have an affirmative action plan that will enable you to get federal contracts. If you have a discriminatory pattern in your employment, it's hard to get federal contracts. This administration came in and overturned that requirement, and so you're back to the old days where all you have to do is just the minimum. And if you have disparities in pay, that's virtually impossible to find out.
Yes, that is what is being realized.
Thank you.
Thank you for calling this meeting. But I'm going to say what's on my mind. When and how soon can we get him impeached? Because he's done everything. We'll pull his Happy Meal out and tell the Democrat Party to bend over. That's not right. And that's what I want to know. When can we get him impeached?
After November 2018.
We're doing fine in the meeting. We're talking about taxes and legislation. Director Mueller is doing an investigation, and when he reports, we'll know what we have, and we'll deal with it then. Until then, I think we ought to be focused on issues that are important. Everybody's all pointing at Russia and memos and all this other kind of what he calls countries. You spend all your time looking at that, and you don't notice that the Department of Labor has a proposed rule that changes the present law. Present law says that if you're working as a server in a restaurant and you get a tip, that tip belongs to you. There is a proposed rule pending in the Department of Labor that changes that to where the tip at the discretion of the employer can be confiscated by the employer. Now, while everybody's talking about Russia and what he calls certain countries, this little regulation is percolating through the Department of Labor. And so I think we need to make sure that we don't divert our attention and miss a lot of the stuff that's going on. Higher Education Act. When President Johnson in 1965 signed the Higher Education Act, he says that this bill means that any child anywhere in this great country of ours can go to any college or university in any state and not be turned away because the family is poor. Well, we passed the Education and Workforce Committee on a party line vote, passed the Higher Education Act that would actually make it more expensive for people to go to college. And so we need to make sure we're paying attention to all of the issues and let Director Mueller get the evidence, and he'll tell us in due course when it's ready what we can do.
My name is Sheila, and I just wanted to say that, like the other lady, he's not going to be impeached fast enough because he needs to undo a lot of things that are happening to people. And I feel, this is my personal opinion, people need to look more close at things that, not what they're showing you, you know, but look close to what they are not showing. by going on the internet and educate yourself on a lot of things that is going on that a lot of people don't know about. I'm just going to use myself for an example. My husband works every day, 7 days a week, mechanic, making, what funds he get. I'm a housewife, only a low spouse support. I took it early because I needed the money. It affected me financially by doing it, but I didn't have any choice. And I'm one of the people can't get insurance because of the fact they say I'm not old enough. I don't have any children. So I don't know what to do in society but continue to stretch what dollars I have. And there's a lot of people being affected by it just like me. They don't think about the poor. They'll talk about it, but the poor are suffering. And I tell people, I don't need no disrespect from everyone that's out there working. J-O-B, I tell people every day, just over broke. And that's what you're doing. You're a slave today for to take care of those that are rich. And when you make your income, guess what? You can't even take care of yourself. So I want to know, is there something out there that can help people like me that's doing the right thing? My children are grown and, they on their own. So what program you have?
Well, there are a number of things we're trying to do. One is increase the minimum wage so that you get paid more. The other is you mentioned health care. You couldn't get health care. There is a proposal in the General Assembly to expand Medicaid. And the vote is within 1 or 2 votes, one way or the other, in both the House and the Senate. The governor said he'll sign the bill if they can get it passed. And so they are considering right now expanding Medicaid. And if you're close to the poverty level, you'll either get a Medicaid card or pay virtually nothing for insurance in the marketplace. But the General Assembly hadn't expanded yet, but they are within 1 or 2 votes in both the House and the Senate. So call your legislators and make sure they're encouraged to do the right thing.
Any particular times that it would be good to send letters out to those that make decisions? Every day you say? Okay.
Yes, every day. And the General Assembly is in session for a 60-day session. They're in about the middle of it right now. So if you wait 2 months, if you wait 4 or 5 weeks, they're going to be gone and finished. So right now is the time. And healthcare would be one of the issues that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna help you. Hi, Congressman. I'm sorry. My question's much broader than everybody else's. Obviously, most people that are here understand what I've been calling the Donor Relief Act of 2017. The Donor Relief Act is also known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is essentially just them giving money to their donors. We all support you. For the most part, I can speak for myself, and I think everybody else here knows that you are fighting for us. What can we as constituents of CD3 do to help you do your job better and to help you fight?
Well, I appreciate the support.
My name's Kristan Canito, by the way. I know your office knows me. They probably hate me by now.
Okay, well, first of all, let me make one thing clear before we get too far off base here. This is an official event. The legislators and city council kind of fuzzify the difference, but on the federal level, there's a significant difference between what we can do with federal funds and what we can do on the campaign side. This is an official event paid for by taxpayers' money, and so we shouldn't be campaigning. And so that's in other forums. I'm not discouraging anybody, but we should not be talking about what we can do in campaigns. I would say that anybody in the 3rd Congressional District also has 2 United States senators, both of which have been fighting for health care and many of the other things that have been mentioned so far. But yesterday there was in Norfolk, there was an event called Engage Norfolk, where a lot of people, and I think some here tonight participated, agencies and nonprofits and everybody displayed what they were doing, all the candidates were out there. But if you can get engaged, generally, a lot of the advocacy groups would be extremely helpful.
Hello, my name is Teresa Smith. In your slide presentation, I didn't see anything about charitable contributions, and I read that charitable contributions were going to be impacted by the tax cuts, and I wanted to verify that.
Well, the charitable contributions are still deductible. The problem, as the gentleman indicated, if you're not having deductible expenses for husband and wife exceeding $24,000, you essentially forget about all of them and just take the standard deduction. They are still available if you have significant deductions already. Charitable deductions still count. But you have to have, to be worthwhile on your tax form, they would have to be part of itemized deductions that significantly exceed $12,000 an individual, $24,000 a couple. Otherwise, you don't get any deduction unless you itemize. Now, a lot of people, if you have deductions, if you have mortgage interest deduction, state and local taxes, significant charitable contributions, that's where most of the deductions come from for individuals. If you have a significant number of them, then you can still deduct it. But most people will be taking the standard deduction and won't be fooling with itemized deductions.
Thank you, Congressman, for being here for this event. My comment was looking at the deficit, right? With the tax cut and now with the budget passage, that deficit's going to only get bigger, right? And you made a comment on how are we going to pay for it, right? But what was missed in there is even in fiscal year 2016, we were way over budget. So what was the strategy that was actually going to get us to a balanced budget? And it's convenient to say, hey, we're going to raise the corporate tax cut again to get back there. Well, we weren't back there. We haven't been back there since 2000. So what are the strategies for that? And now the Democratic Party is in a minority, so there was a time when the Democratic Party was a majority and still no balanced budget.
Well, no, let's be precise here. First major vote I cast as a member of Congress was on the 93 Clinton budget.
It's 25 years ago.
That's right. And 8 years after that, Chairman Greenspan was answering questions before the committees. What's going to happen when we pay off the entire national debt? What's going to happen when there are no federal bonds? What's going to happen to long-term interest rates and mortgage rates when we pay off the national debt? That was in 2001, the beginning of 2001. Then we passed a major tax cut, didn't pay for it. Fought 2 wars, didn't pay for it. Passed another tax cut, didn't pay for it. Prescriptive drug benefit, didn't pay for it. And all of a sudden, we're back in the ditch. But in 2001, we were on course by 2008 to pay off the entire national debt held by the public. And, we borrowed money from these trust funds, put all the money back in the trust funds by 2013. So when you said bipartisan Democrats, when they were in charge, didn't do it, in 1995, after Gingrich got elected Speaker, took over the House, Clinton allowed the government to get shut down on numerous occasions rather than let them destroy his budget. And as a result of that, it didn't get dismantled, and we were on a trajectory to paying off the entire national debt until the next president came in and oversaw the tax cuts.
Okay, so that's perfect because that does kind of blend into my next thought. How does the Democrat, you might not be able to answer this because it's not campaign season, but how does the Democratic Party able to spin that the conservative, the GOP is the fiscally conservative party when they clearly are not? How do we change the tide of that moving forward?
I got to tell you, they make better speeches on the deficit than Democrats do. as they were trying to dismantle the Clinton budget, I was sitting on the floor listening to them talk about the debt and the tragedy of having your grandchildren pay off the national debt and all that. And then the next thing out of their mouth was an unpaid for tax cut. And one of the problems we have in the discussion is the Republicans do not believe the tax cuts affect the budget. And just a fundamental violation of principles of arithmetic. But that's where they are. And so they can pass a $1.5 trillion tax cut not paid for, and then 2 weeks later, or a couple of weeks later, say that spending $300 billion more is the worst thing that ever happened. I mean, the gentleman who shut down the government Friday night, or Thursday night, had voted for the $1.5 trillion tax cut.
But tax cuts are not spending, so for Rand Paul to vote against a tax cut bill and then vote against the budget, that's just sort of disingenuous, I think.
That's right. Well, it's arithmetic.
I understand.
And if you're going to spend more, you got to tax more. If you're going to cut taxes, then you got to cut spending. What they do is, we ought to be able to cut spending, therefore we're going to actually do a tax cut, pass the tax cut, and then find they can't do the spending cuts because nobody wants to vote for them.
So it's a messaging thing that we need to figure out as a
Well,
whole.
they're better at messaging than we are.
My very last little comment, apologize for holding it up, is as the Democratic Party is aging, we need to get more young blood out there to engage the millennials. Where's my under 30 crowd? Under 30 crowd? Under 30. We got 3 years to be president, so under 30 right now. So it is a blue wave coming. So is there any consideration, as much as we love you, for you yourself to identify that you're a part of the aging Democratic Party?
If somebody can do better for education of the next generation than I can, I'll see him in November.
Thank you so much for coming out. We really appreciate it. I wish they had more lights on you so we could see you better, but we got to take it when we can get it. I've been saying for years that things are rigged. You know, you see it in sports, you see it in the courts, you see it almost everywhere you look. And so for years, I was thinking that the safest place to be is a government job. You know, in order for you to miss out on your paycheck, you'd have to. The country would have to go broke. So I said, this is safe. But now looking at some of the bills and some of the things that are coming down the pipe, it seems like they're going after the money that's in retirees, benefits, retirees, former and past employees, and they're going after that money now. So I'm trying to figure out, I just want to know, is anybody safe? No.
The people in the cemetery. That ain't me.
There was a study done about whose jobs are at risk because of automation. You do things like driverless cars and think who's at risk if you don't need a driver for a car or a delivery truck, and how many jobs would be at risk. You can ask bank tellers what happened to the number of bank tellers the bank needs when we went to the ATMs. When's the last time you went to the airport and people don't need somebody to check them in, you check yourself in. And so a lot of jobs, because of automation, are at risk. You mentioned retirement. One of the things in the budget bill we just passed is the creation of a committee to see what we can do about people's pensions. There are a lot of people whose pension funds are about to go broke and will end up with little or no pension. We have for those pension funds that go broke, we got a pension benefit guarantee fund, PBGC, to step in when people's trust funds go broke. Let me tell you, the projection now is that guarantee fund is broke. And we need to do something about it. So pensions, jobs at risk. We're in a very dicey kind of economy. Now, government employees, when you hear people talk about government employees and a budget, sometimes I listen to my colleagues and they think how much you spend at an agency is unrelated to how much services you can get out of agencies. Like you can fire half the people and expect as much work to get done as with twice as many people. Now, if you want twice as much work done, it's going to cost you twice as much. You cut the budget in half, less is going to be done. I heard people talking about the VA, and we need more investments in the Veterans Administration healthcare system. They cut the budget, and then we're worried, how come the veterans weren't getting the service they need? And you say, well, that's because you cut the budget. And then you're just totally unrelated. You know, cut the budget, they still ought to be able to get good services. So we are trying to get some common sense going where people recognize that if you want services, you got to pay the bill. We got to make sure people's pensions are protected. And we got to make sure that we're looking out for the next generation of jobs to make sure that we don't let automation put people in the street without having people be able to transition into good jobs. So there's a lot of stuff going on the Committee on Education and the Workforce, looking at what the workforce is going to look like and how we prepare the next generation for that workforce.
Sounds like we need you in 2020.
Yes, my friend down there, he just waited we're going to stop the questions at the people in line right now. So we'll do the people in line, and then that'll be it.
Okay, just one last quick question. This is about the coming over here this morning. I mean, this evening, going through the tunnels. When do we get our tunnels back?
Well, let me tell you this. That infrastructure plan where the president is putting up $200 billion and expects $1.5 trillion worth of work to get done anticipates a lot of private financing. Now, private business isn't going to put up the money without having the infrastructure pay for it, and the only way you do that is with tolls. Maybe bonds, but probably tolls. So if his plan passes the way it is presently proposed, you can expect more tolls, not less.
That would be true. Good evening, sir. Mr. Scott, thank you for your service, and thank you for being one of the few honorable men left. Maybe I wasn't even funny. The guy with these stupid questions.
Wait, we can be respectful. We can disagree and be respectful.
I have a personal question about
And let me just say this. When I first ran for the House of Delegates, I was 30 years old, so I'm not against young people running for stuff.
I remember. And I'm a veteran, and the VA is even more screwed up than it was before, where they think they were correcting. But I had monies taken out of my Social Security against my wishes, and somehow I was able to get him to put the money back in there. It was taken for something that I don't even use, since I'm covered under my veterans benefits for the Affordable Care Act. So they were taking money from Medicare when I don't use it. And so I got the funds put back in my check, right? I thought it was unfair that someone would go in my check and take monies against my wishes. I thought I was protected under Social Security. Now, once they corrected the problem, where did that money go? I got a letter from the IRS saying how much they withheld for that. Where do I get my money back?
I don't know, but Ben will give you a card, and call him, and we'll get all. Okay, well, we'll get all the information and try to get you an answer.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Congressman Scott. I'm a constituent from Hampton. My name is Jennifer Brown. And I come with a question regarding the civil rights of the disability community. Currently coming up before the House is Bill HR 620, which is a bill that will literally strip and gut the ADA by allowing businesses to have a waiting period before a citizen with a disability's rights are violated under the ADA before they can, press charges or seek due process. And there's several other things in this bill that are terribly disturbing, and I'm not even sure that the community is aware of HR 620 that's supposed to come up for a vote later this week. I would like to know your position on this bill, or if you are aware of it.
I'm aware of it, I'm against it.
And what are we doing to try to stop it? Because I'm afraid it's looking as if it's going to sail through.
I don't know what's going to happen to it. It has a lot of support, and the support is unfortunately bipartisan. Basically what it does is eliminates any incentive to comply with the ADA, because you can wait until there's a formal complaint made. At that point you can comply. Right now, if you're out of compliance, you're subject to a lawsuit, and so you have, or other enforcement mechanisms, so you have an incentive to be in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. This bill passes, there's no incentive. And if you never have a complaint, you never have to be in compliance. And I think that it puts incentives the wrong way. I expect to, if a schedule allows, that I'll be speaking against the bill when it comes up.
Thank you very much, Congressman.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to give a compliment to everybody who spoke earlier. You all were sharp and well informed. Some of my questions may not be as informed, but there are questions better yet. My question is in regards to education as a starting point. You mentioned that you're an advocate for education and seeing as though we have a new Secretary of Education and her own goals and values and views towards education. I was wondering, with this new tax plan and this spending bill, exactly how does it impact people from poorer communities, more rural communities, such as people, not really such as people, but communities who can't afford, or whose composite index is not really catered towards James County, if that makes sense?
Well, one thing the tax bill does, by limiting the state and local tax deduction, makes it less likely that localities will raise taxes, because since it's tax deductible, when they raise taxes, it doesn't cost as much. You eliminate the tax deduction, and you're likely to get more opposition. You can't raise local taxes, you can't fund, you can ask the school board what happens when you don't have money coming from the locality. You can't do a good job with education. So one of the first things the tax bill did was to, by removing the deductibility from a substantial portion of your local and state taxes, make it less likely that you're going to be able to fund education. That's just the tax bill. The higher education bill makes going to college and universities more expensive. We passed about a year and a half ago the Every Student Succeeds Act, which gives the localities more flexibility, and the implementation of that is to a large extent going to depend on how well the localities and states respond. Some are responding extremely well, and some not so hot. We're depending on the Department of Education rejecting plans that don't come up to standards. Some, I think, have been approved that, in fact, do not come up to standards, and we're having that debate now.
So, how does that impact a city such as Portsmouth, where you see the downtown area is being decimated as far as, previous attractions that once existed, such as that, the Hall of Fame Museum, that is vacant, but now they're trying to sell it for like 3.5, and then they have to discount it again, which creates a vacuum of taxpayer dollars. So I was just wondering what program or what incentive are you considering with your constituents to figure out how to offset so that the children who are in Portsmouth can have a
Well, local development is a local issue. What the federal government can do is to make sure that localities have some resources to do the development. Community Development Block Grant is one of those areas, and unfortunately that's been on the chopping block. Every time you turn around, when you're cutting spending, that's one of the first things that is a target for spending cuts. The Community Development Block Grant gives the locality the ability to look at its area and figure out what they want to do. It's a very flexible grant, and community development, economic development, doing something with empty buildings. That's what a lot of localities do with the money, and we need to make sure that that line item is as big as possible. Unfortunately, every time you look around, that's one of the things that's being cut.
Lastly, I'm not going to take up too much of your time, but as you can see from the pendant on my chest, I am an HBCU graduate. One of my sticking points is to see how has the bills that you have proposed or that you said are being passed in Congress or in the Senate, how are they going to impact HBCUs, and how have we made it so that HBCUs don't have to run through continuous loops and holes to get funding that ODU and University of Virginia doesn't have to go through?
Well, first is you have to differentiate HBCUs into public and private. Public universities, if Norfolk State, if they get their fair share of the money, and there have been lawsuits over the years, Maryland is just in the process of settling their lawsuit now because the state HBCUs were not getting their fair share of state money. That's different from the private universities, Hampton University, because the state doesn't have anything to do with them other than what they do for everybody else. The TAG grants, tuition assistance grants, you need to make sure those are as big as possible. But one of President Obama's initiatives, America's College Promise, which is 2 years of free college at a community college. As the ranking member of the Education Committee, he wanted me to introduce it. And when it was finally typed up, it had in there a provision for the 2 years to be spent at an HBCU, as well as community college. But HBCUs, and HBCUs had a concern that if you can go to community college free, why would you go to Hampton or Norfolk State? And by the time I'd introduced it, United Negro College Fund, Thurgood Marshall, NAFIO, and all endorsed the bill.
So
we fixed it.
Y'all fixed it for the people who are pro-HBCUs, but what happened as far as getting it passed?
Well, getting it passed, we're still working on it.
Still working on it?
Yeah.
Still along?
Yeah. The Higher Education Act that we passed is a major step backwards for people. HBCUs lose, everybody loses, because it is more expensive. They eliminate some grants, so it costs you more to go to college, and when you're trying to pay back the loan, it's more expensive to pay it back. And so we're hopefully, and that bill's coming up pretty soon.
We know that a lot of them, as far as infrastructure and how they're overdeveloped building-wise, are on the down end.
That's why they need more support, and that's what the bill that I introduced would have provided.
All right, well, this is the best as far as getting more support and seeing where it goes.
We're doing the best we can. We're in the minority now. We're going to try to fix that in November.
There you go.
I'd like to know, some of us have noticed a little bit of money in our checks. What I would like to know is next year, when I file my taxes, am I going to have to pay for that money they gave me? Because I remember when George Bush II gave us the $300, I ended up having to pay more taxes on it. Now, I know they changed the tax brackets, But this money might put me in another tax bracket, so that means I'm gonna have to pay more taxes on this money I'm supposed to be getting every 2 weeks.
The withholding should be at a level that would pay the taxes owed and no more, so that it should be sufficient to pay the taxes, and so you should not have, if you have withheld the right amount, you should not have to pay additional taxes at the end, unless you had some additional income.
All right, well, they've gotten rid of my mortgage and my personal property and some other tax breaks that I was getting. And now they're giving me this, what is it, $36.85, which is going to make me about $427 at the end of the year next year, which is going to put me in another tax bracket. I already looked at it. So I need to know what else can I take out so I don't have to pay nothing, because I'm going to be a very mad lady.
Well, if you don't think your withholding is sufficient, then you can always increase your withholding.
Well, I'm already increasing it from my state retirement and from my federal retirement. I'm already increasing it $100 a payday, me and my husband both. So we're already doing that, so we wouldn't have to pay so much. And I wouldn't want to be a new tax.
I would have to look at your individual returns.
I'll send it to your office.
We'll get somebody to look at it. Vince will give you a call.
Good evening, Congressman Scott. My name is Jamal Brazil. I work for the federal government, which is very interesting. My question to you is more so for the Gen Xers, as we are referred to. After looking at the election in November, it painted a real dismal picture. Then we get a tax bill that says, guess what? Education is going to be higher. Higher education is going to cost me. I'm a recent graduate of ODU, sorry. The young man that said something. But now if I say, hey, I want to go back for my master's, I'm an engineer for the shipyard. That sounds great, but when you increase my taxes and I have student loans, I'm still sitting.
Well, in the Higher Education Act, we made it more expensive for you to go to college, and particularly more expensive to go to graduate school. We eliminated a lot of support for graduate schools. We eliminated some supports for going to undergraduate, and eliminated some more. So it is more expensive. If this, I don't think the bill that was reported out of committee that I opposed, I don't think that bill is going to get through the House and Senate and be signed by the President. It might, but I don't think so, because it goes in the wrong direction.
So for someone like myself who is trying to be a productive member of society, how can I find inspiration? Do I have to wait till November? How can I find inspiration to buy a house? Because now I might as well keep renting, because if I'm getting nothing back, no benefits from having a house, what's the point of even trying to move forward?
Well, the question about a house is an individual decision. The tax implication, that's just one calculation. What you can afford, where it is it likely to appreciate or depreciate. If you talk to a realtor, they can give you a kind of a broad perspective as to whether or not it's in your best interest to buy a house. For most people, it is. And for most people in the middle class, a home is how you acquire wealth. You don't have any savings, no nothing, but when you pay off your mortgage, you have the full value of your house. And so for most people, moving up into the middle class and achieving wealth is usually starts off with home ownership.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, good evening, Congressman Bob Scott. I have a question I would like to ask you. I wrote this out before I came here, and I've got 2 pages of it. This it's not that much on the page. But the reason I say I got 2 pages, the first page I like to pass to you, and the second page I keep for myself. I did not know whether you're asking these questions or not. The one that you want to miss, you have my permission to omit it, but I would like to pass it to you. It will take less time. Is that fair?
Well, if it's individual questions, we can talk.
To me, it's fair. I trust you.
Okay, well, if it's individual, we can do it and don't have to take everybody's time. We'll just talk to you directly.
I would like for everybody in the audience to
Okay,
hear.
well, let's go.
Right.
Read the question.
Well, which of these questions you want to ask?
Some of them, well, the first one, the rich pay less, the rich pay less tax than everybody else.
That's right.
Than the middle class citizens, the middle class pay less than the poor people. It is this right, then is God right. So this makes America great again. Our government put the new man in the White House to make America great again. The new man don't have to pay tax or show his tax records. He do not have to have a top security clearance to be in the White House. He is above the law. I have a lot of questions to ask, but we will be here all night to get an answer. What about the new man being a head member of the KKK? Everyone know what the KKK stand for. Number 1, superiority over people of color, support for hate crimes, cause racist riots and property vandalism, harass, hardship, and mental abuse. The president can fire the head of the FBI, to remain above the law. He does not get a bad security clearance because the FBI cannot no longer investigate him. The commander-in-chief in the military, KKK, what a military parade down Main Street in Washington, D.C. I think we need impeachment.
I would love for you to take that back to Washington, D.C., and I would love to see you on TV answering these questions.
I think it was a comment rather than a question.
No, it is a question. I put question marks down there.
I'd rather see you on national TV answering these questions. And you can tell them that you got it from the public. Because we are the public. We voted. We stand in line for an hour to vote for who we wanted for president. This president was not elected by the majority of the people.
And my last question.
Congressman, I'd like to thank you for coming out and giving us this breakdown. I think that's one of the things that leads the public to be persuaded by propaganda that we don't often hear these details. So when folks go to vote, they don't really realize what the ultimate impact is. And so thank you for that. My question, I'm going to start with a brief kind of statement, and then I have a question at the end, so bear with me. I actually received a master's in public policy, and for my degree I decided to study the political economic history of the United States from the beginning. And thanks to our government and open access, I was able to pull data from 1786 forward. Because of our public, from 1776, so it was 2 years after the country was formed, you can pull open public data down and analyze what our history is like. In the first 100 years, we avoided doing deficit spending, actually about the first 120 years. Except in the case of wars we had no choice in. One was the Revolutionary War, which took us 25 years to pay off, and the Civil War, which took us 35 years to pay off. In the history of our country, we struggled in the beginning with the states' rights versus the federal rights, and we had a shift in banking several times, going from states to federal, Federal didn't do so well, we take the centennial. So everybody remembers from history class, not worth the centennial, right? And then we had the Revolutionary War, and we got our act a little bit together on finances. The country was growing, it was helping, but we were struggling in the 1800s with a series of recessions, much like what we just went through between the Clinton years and when Obama got in office, where the economy just seemed to be spinning. During that period, we ended up creating the Federal Reserve Bank. And oftentimes you hear folks talking about, let's get rid of the Federal Reserve, and all I can think is, no, don't. There were so many illegal transactions before that period where people would do scamming and certificates and all kinds of things that it would be terrible to ever consider eliminating that group. What we then saw is we went through World War I and World War II. And thank God for anyone who was in that generation from World War II for the sacrifice they gave. I think the young people don't realize how much it was. Folks were literally living on food stamps. Women who had been working, many didn't have jobs, left their homes to take on the jobs that men had. And the funny thing is, we were able to survive and win that war because we didn't judge what somebody's skill set was when they were doing that job. They were able to go in there and do the job with training. Now, today, and this is where I'm leading up to my question, today, when employers go to hire someone, they want somebody who already has the skill set. We won World War II because we didn't judge people. We hired them and we said, we can teach you. Now I heard you talking about, we're in a mega trend. The World Bank, the IMF is talking about it. They're talking about more automation. The trend is they're seeing we're going to need more people who have technology skills, who can do the IT stuff. There's a gap in our training in our school systems. We've verbally pushed STEM under Obama, but we're, but at the same time, we're talking about the new administration's cutting back spending on education. And so what I'm concerned about is, as I look at the Trump administration, is it's almost like someone's trying to dismantle the United States. And they're going after our environmental protection laws. They're going after our FBI. They're going after our justice system. They're trying to stir up tension by bringing up past discrimination and encouraging it almost. They're pulling back funding on education. We don't need to go down that path. What we need to do is to teach our young people in elementary school, much like Europe does, preparing them to make career decisions so that then when they go to take classes in middle school and high school, they're taking courses that will prepare them for what they want to do in life. If you ask a kid in grade school or kindergarten what they want to do when they grow up, they're going to tell you they want to be a fireman or a doctor or a nurse because those are the people they've met in life. When you ask a kid in high school what they want to do, they don't know the answer. That is not true in Europe. And so I'm wondering, sir, my question to you is, what can we do? And maybe it's just, it gets back to politics, and the party of the people pulls together and comes up with a plan. But what can we do to help change our education system without a big expense, just teaching kids about job opportunities and what their decisions mean, preparing them in elementary school, going out to that Department of Labor website and seeing what jobs are out there so they make wise decisions about the courses they take so that they can work at their jobs. And what do we do to get our corporations to stop, we're not going to hire you unless you already have the skill set. So we're going to go over to India where their college training isn't a college degree, but it's a quick and dirty certificate. And we're going to give all our IT jobs and all our middle class jobs to those folks, and we're gonna let the Americans turn into, folks who are working at restaurants who now make less than minimum wage, and if that labor vote goes through, they will lose their tips that bring them up above minimum wage.
I think a lot of your comments need to be aimed at the local school board, because those are the ones making the decision. But on the federal level, one is a focus on education. We have to make sure that, first of all, the people have access to jobs, to education past the high school level. Most of the jobs of the future will require some education past the high school level, not necessarily a 4-year liberal arts degree, but some education and training past the high school level. The House has passed, and the Senate hadn't taken it up yet, the Career and Technical Education Bill that sets a lot of this in motion. A lot of this is trying to work with the community college so that the high school seniors who are not going to a 4-year liberal arts degree can start getting some job preparedness in the community college. I gave a speech, it's working. I gave a speech at the community college in Franklin a couple of months ago, and everybody's up there in caps and gowns and everything, and they finished their credentials. Somebody asked, how many of y'all are still in high school? And about a third of the hands went up. Still in high school, completed, maybe not the associate's degree, but some certificate program so that they can leave that graduation and get a decent job. We need to make sure in education that we're not setting up, though, a dual system where those that can afford it can get a nice traditional 4-year on-campus liberal arts college education. And those, if you don't have a lot of money, then you get a little certificate program. Or you can get a nice job with a certificate this week. But because of the jobs changing, you may be obsolete 4 or 5 years from now. If you've gone to a 4-year on-campus liberal arts education, you probably have the intellectual capability to switch jobs and lifelong learning. And we need to make sure that that opportunity for the 4-year university degree is not limited to people with wealth. It has been the transformational moment in a person's life where you can go from the lowest income bracket to the highest by going to college. Now, there are a lot of people in America today that don't think much of college. In fact, they did a survey, and 58% of Republicans said, 58% of Republicans said that colleges and universities have a negative effect on the way things are going in the United States today. Really? And it's that group that we're trying to legislate with when you start talking about a 4-year education affordability. And we don't want to, I'm all for certificate programs, high school, working with the community colleges, but you don't want to make sure that kids in high school get on a track where if they decide, all of a sudden they're intellectually stimulated, they can't get back. But all of the successful career technical education programs have you learning your job skills in an academic setting. So if you decide all of a sudden you don't want to be a plumber, you want to be a lawyer, you can switch and still have credentials. You're not stuck in a rut so much you can't switch. That's going to be a challenge because all of the focus now is on apprenticeships and job training certificates and the things you need for a job this afternoon. There are things like coding that you can learn, computer coding that you can learn in a couple of months. They'll get you a $50,000, $60,000 job right off the bat. And a lot more people, that's a good route for them to go. But frankly, I don't think there's anything wrong with having people just generally educated wandering around the community. And you don't get that with a certificate program or online education. You get a skill, but I think we need as many people as qualify and want to do it going to the traditional 4-year on-campus college education where 95% of the value of that is outside of the classroom. dealing with people, learning people, meeting with people, and working with people that you haven't dealt with in the past. And the future of education is going to be as challenging as the future of the workforce. How we prepare people for that, and how we prepare the next generation. And that's not going to be easy when you got the majority running Congress believing that colleges and universities are a bad influence. So that's, we're working on it. Career and technical education is extremely important. And you ask, what can you do? There are a lot of advocacy groups, University Women, American Association of University Women, League of Women Voters, education groups, civil rights groups. There are all kinds of different advocacy groups that you can join and try to make sure that we don't go the wrong direction when we prepare the next generation for the workforce and for life. So I appreciate the question, and I want to express my appreciation for everybody coming out tonight. We have, if you have noticed, in the newspaper and on television, what town hall meetings, congressional town hall meetings look like. This wasn't what you see on television. People have respect for each other. And so I just want to thank the constituents of the 3rd Congressional District. A lot of congressmen, frankly, can't even hold town hall meetings anymore. It's just gotten so bad. So I want to express my appreciation for people coming out, asking questions and engaging, and for the decorum that everybody has shown. Like I said, we're blessed in the 3rd Congressional District that we have good constituents that can have a town hall meeting and that everybody can have their say. So thank you very much.